Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Eichhoff, and I serve as the Associate Director for Alumni Relations at John Carroll University. Thank you for joining us this evening for our next installment of A.C.E.S, the Alumni Continuing Education Series. It is now my honor to introduce our presenter for this evening. Thomas J. Frazier, PhD, received his Bachelor of Science from John Carroll in 1997 and a PhD in Clinical Psychology from Case Western Reserve University in 2004. He joined the Cleveland Clinic as a staff member in pediatrics in 2006, and from 2013 through 17 was the director of the Cleveland Clinic Center for Autism. In 2017, he was hired as the Chief Science Officer at Autism Speaks, overseeing science and service programs before joining John Carroll University in January 2020 as a professor of psychology. Over 15 years, Dr. Frazier has maintained an active clinical practice and research programs focused on the evaluation and treatment of autism, ADHD, and related conditions. He has published more than 120 scientific papers and has ongoing collaborations across the United States and internationally. His most impactful work has been improving early diagnosis and assessment, as well as understanding an autism genetic syndrome associated with cancer. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Frazier. Tom, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to share my screen so folks can see the presentation. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight, and I'm especially grateful so many folks have decided to join in the evening. I see a lot of folks I know too, so thank you guys for coming. I decided, I have an hour here, but I probably will only try to fill up 35 minutes because I'd like to be able to take questions. I'm passionate about autism. I have a 17-year-old son with autism and intellectual disability. I've been doing autism research really since 2006. Before that, doing most of my research in ADHD and pediatric bipolar disorder, as well as practice. And as Eric mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I retrained in translational science and worked with the head of genomic medicine at the Cleveland Clinic, whose name is Dr. Karis Ang, on a genetic syndrome called a gene called P10. So what I'd like to do is just hopefully whet people's appetite a little bit for what's happening in autism and what's new and what's important and different. And then as I, sort of work through some general areas, I'm hoping that folks will have questions. If you have a clarifying question along the way, I'd be happy to take it. But if you can save big questions for the end, I'd appreciate it. One of the most common things I get asked about is, why are there more people with autism around now than there used to be? So just a couple of basic facts here. The CDC surveys every 2 years 8-year-olds to look at the prevalence of autism. And what they found most recently in 2020 was that 1 in 54 children in the US was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. They recently, in 2021, released a study of adults. It was the first study that they had done, and they found that approximately 2% of adults were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So it looks like the prevalence of autism is settling between 2 and 2.5%. We'll see if it continues to rise, though. And this is a figure I like to show because back in 2004, which seems like a long time ago now, but autism was 1 in 166 individuals was diagnosed with autism. In 2020, that number had risen up to 1 in 54, so about 2% of the population. We see fairly similar numbers worldwide, although the prevalence estimates are slightly lower. It really depends on how much work they do to ascertain cases, but in general, I think the worldwide prevalence of autism is remarkably consistent, given all the differences in how people look for autism in using different measures and different methodologies. So autism, unfortunately or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, is a condition that seems to be fairly consistent across populations and across the world. one of the other questions I get asked is, is this rising? And if it's rising, why is it rising? Well, we know that the prevalence is rising. We don't know if the actual number of cases is increasing or if it's just greater awareness. The chart on the right comes from a paper published in Nature about a decade ago, where they tried to tease out some of the reasons that they thought autism diagnoses may be increasing. And the chart on the left is my interpretation of that chart and sort of what I think may be going on. And, you can see the biggest thing on the chart here is that there's this huge chunk of unknown. We don't know why autism prevalence may be increasing. Some people will still tell you that it's not increasing. We're just much better at identifying it. I don't fall in that camp. I actually fall in the camp that says that autism is increasing slightly. But there is debate about that, and I should be upfront about that debate. So one of the things we've been doing over the last 25 years is trying to understand the etiology of autism, what causes autism, and the idea being that if you can understand what's driving autism, then you can help people with autism with personalized interventions and supports. And so autism genetics is a very active area and really has been for 20 years, but the technologies have finally allowed us to make a lot of progress. So I'll just share with you some of that progress, starting with some of the things we knew back in the 80s, which was that autism is a highly genetic but complex condition. We know that because if you just look at siblings, the recurrence rate for autism is somewhere between 4 and 20%. If you look at fraternal twins, so non-identical twins, the concordance rate is between 20 and 30%. But when you look at identical twins, many studies will identify concordance rates between 85 and 100%. This right away tells us that autism is a highly genetic, but also a very complex genetic condition, because obviously identical twins share all or almost all of their DNA, whereas fraternal twins and siblings share only 50%, full siblings share only 50% of their DNA. Now, this slide just shows differences in sibling recurrence. So for individuals where there's no other sibling diagnosed with autism in the family, if the child is female, the recurrence rate is about 0.5%. Whereas if it's a male, it's about 2.5%, 2.4%. If there's one other sibling diagnosed in the family, this increases substantially to 6.5% for females and 20 to 26% for males. And if there's two other sibs with autism diagnosed in the family, you can see that in males, this jumps up to a 50% recurrence rate. So again, this tells us that there is obviously a genetic component to autism. But it also tells us that there may be a female protective factor, because we generally say that autism is about 3 to 4 times more likely in males than females. And this is kind of a complicated figure, but I can boil it down really simply, which is that really, really smart researchers have been able to take a look at genetic data and estimate the number of genes that they think may be involved in autism. And so one of the estimates is that there's about 400 genes, but there's a big confidence interval around that. It could be as low as 250, could be as high as 1,260 genes that are associated with autism. One of the things we have learned, though, about these genes is that many of the genetic changes that are involved in autism, that are important in autism, are de novo. They're not inherited. They're new genetic changes that were not in the parent, but are then transmitted to the child through the sperm and the egg. This is a very recent, large-scale genetic sequencing study. Over the last decade, we've seen a real massive improvement in genetic technologies that allows us, in this case, to ascertain all of or almost all of the DNA that codes for genes or proteins. And this study by Joe Buxbaum was able to identify over 100 ASD-associated genes, or autism spectrum disorder-associated genes. And it was able to look at some of these genes to see what they're involved in. And most of these genes are expressed in neurons and brain cells, although they're expressed in different biological pathways. And we're starting to grow a list of genes now that are associated with autism. In fact, this list is a little old, so I don't have all 100 high confidence genes on the list, but you can see there are a number of different genes that we now feel pretty comfortable with including on the list. The genes at the bottom here, I studied the gene P10, PTEN. I also have done studies on SYNGAP1, and actually my current research is involving SYNGAP1 as one of the genetic syndromes. We'll also be looking at SCN2A. So there's a number, and ADNP. So there's a number of genes here that we feel pretty comfortable are related to autism, and we're starting to study these as single genetic syndromes. We think that by studying these individual genes, we can get a much better understanding of exactly how changes in this gene led to autism. And a lot of times when I talk about this, people will ask me, like, why is this so important? I mean, why are we doing all these really expensive genetic studies? Why is it that people keep talking about genetics of autism? I don't really care about it. You know, the reason why a lot of researchers are, you know, so focused on genes is because if we identify genes that we think are associated with autism, well, those genes code for proteins, and those proteins participate in certain biological pathways. And as a result of that we can start to identify some targets for intervention, biological interventions. And really the idea here is if we find genes, we can study those genes, we can identify what they do in the body, and then we can start to look for personalized genetic-based treatments. And this is just an example figure. It's real complicated. I'm not gonna do anything but show it to you, but what you can see here is in the different colors, these colors represent different biological processes or pathways that some of the autism genes are involved in. So you can see some of these genes are involved in how the synapse functions. Some of them are involved in calcium channels in particular in the neuron. Some of them are involved in how genes express themselves. Others are involved in how two different neural cells connect together. And so we're starting to get these sort of clusters of genes that do specific kinds of things in the body. And this is exciting because it may be that as we find these clusters of genes, we can start to identify interventions that would maybe make a difference, not just for a specific gene, but for clusters of different genes involved in autism. So unfortunately, you know, we've come a long way. In fact, we've come really as far in autism as we have in any other developmental disorder out there. I used to study ADHD and pediatric bipolar disorder, and it's really, you know, unfortunately, we haven't made nearly as much progress in those areas in terms of the biology of those conditions as we have in autism. But there's still a lot we don't know. For example, we can only identify a specific genetic cause in about 20 to 30% of autism cases. We also don't really have a good understanding of how our genes interact with the environment. So this is an area called epigenetics, and we're very much in the infancy of trying to study epigenetics for autism. And we also, unfortunately, don't have a really good understanding of small genetic effects. So all of those genes I told you about before, they have very large, very powerful effects on the person. We still have a lot of work to do to understand some of the smaller genetic effects that may add up. And if you add up enough of those genetic effects, it may contribute to autism. So once you've identified genes, you can start to really study those genes. And one of the things we try to do once we've identified a gene is start to create preclinical models. And so obviously it's really hard to study the brain in detail in humans. So people will identify models of flies and fish and mice and even monkeys. MIT, I was just on the phone with folks at MIT last week, and they have a very large monkey lab that has macaques and marmosets, and they collaborate with researchers in China as well. And so they're starting to develop monkey models of autism to really understand what some of these genes are doing. Obviously, there's practical and ethical issues. I'm not going to get into that. I just want to mention to people that this is one of the ways we can study these genes. And what people do is they create a particular model. Let's say it's a model of P10 related autism. They then study that model and try to understand all of the pathophysiology, the brain changes that happen as a result of those genetic changes. And then they'll attempt to rescue the model. I think this is probably an archaic term, rescue, but they'll attempt to change and intervene in the model to sort of change back behavior to what would be more neurotypical. And we've already seen a bunch of these models happen. Fragile X, Rett syndrome, neurofibromatosis, tuberous sclerosis, and P10 are examples of models that have been created. We think that some of these models all have to do with abnormal brain plasticity, how our brain sort of, all throughout our adulthood, our brains do remain plastic. The level of plasticity sort of decreases with age, but they do remain plastic. And we think that some of that plasticity may be related to autism. And so studying these models can help us. And if we try to rescue or intervene in these models, we may be able to restore some of the functions of the brain, and as a result, improve some of the symptoms of some of these conditions. So this is just an example of some of the different rescues we've worked on, or our folks that I've worked with have worked on. A reasonable question to ask, okay, we've got all these models of autism. That's cool. I'm glad we're studying those models, and it's pretty interesting that we've been able to reverse back symptoms and problems in those models. But why don't we have any treatments for humans? Why don't we have any interventions, biological interventions for autism in humans? And really the reason for that is that humans are incredibly complicated, and only about 10% of mouse models actually lead to a treatment that makes a difference for humans. And so there's a lot of work to be done even after you've created a model. And one of the new models we're creating is induced pluripotent stem cells. So you can take a skin cell from a person and you can turn it into a stem cell, and then turn that stem cell into a brain cell. And you can study the individual's brain cells through that method. And that's another mechanism that we're just starting to do in autism that we think will be another way to look for biological treatments for people with autism. This slide just shows you some work that I've done with Kara Sang here on individuals with P10 associated autism. You can see that these people have very large head sizes. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is not only can studying these genetic syndromes help us to look for biological treatments, but we can actually find things that help the patients with autism now. So in the case of P10 autism, we identified that their brain structure was very different. They had these white matter changes in their brain that I'll show you on these slides, where the white parts of the brain, the connective tissue of the brain, was appearing to be a bit abnormal in a lot of these cases, even up through adulthood. And we were seeing that these white matter abnormalities were actually driving some of the cognitive problems that these folks had. And we thought, well, this is kind of interesting, because maybe if we identify a treatment, we could start to track the white matter as a way to understand if this treatment is working. And in fact, there's a clinical trial that I helped to design of a medicine called everolimus for people with P10 autism that's underway right now. And we'll have the results pretty soon to see whether or not this actually worked and helped to improve their functioning and their white matter changes. But this is kind of the model that we want to do, is find the gene, look for the treatment, and then understand what that treatment might be able to do for the patients. So I mentioned, though, that, aside from looking for these biological treatments, we can actually help the patients now. And so in the case of P10 individuals, what I was able to identify was that these individuals have slower processing speed. They have trouble with paying attention to certain kinds of information. And so we can make recommendations to their teachers. We can make recommendations to their treatment professionals to use shorter, slower communication methods, to ask attention questions, to repeat information so that they can retain it, so that it gets from working memory into long-term memory. And then most of these individuals have problems with fine and gross motor skills, so we can refer them for occupational and physical therapy very early in their life to really help them to make the best progress they can in their motor development. And there's a lot of things we still need to learn about P10 autism, and we're going to need to study this for the next decade at least, but it's pretty cool that already even the first few studies that we've done have been able to make a difference in patients' lives. And I still get emails very regularly from families just asking me to look at their reports and say, what other recommendations can they make for their providers? Because it's exciting to the families. Yeah, we might not have a biological treatment for these individuals yet, but at least we can do something now to improve their daily lives and their functioning. The other big issue we see in autism is these co-occurring conditions. So there's been an estimate that as many as 90% of people with autism have a co-occurring medical or mental health condition. And so this slide is just meant to demonstrate that you have the core symptoms of autism, which are really social communication difficulties and restricted repetitive behaviors and interests. Those are really the two core features of autism. But you've also got many people that have ADHD or mood difficulties or anxiety. You have some people with ADHD, like my son, that have significant self-injury. Some people have aggression. You can even have severe eating and feeding issues. Many people with autism have disrupted sleep, especially early in their lives. You see a lot of folks with autism with constipation and other GI conditions. Epilepsy is very common. And many people, including my son, are nonverbal or minimally verbal and have intellectual disability as well as autism. And so, autism is a very complicated picture, and we really just don't want to think about autism. We want to think about all the things that go around autism as well. And we're starting to better understand some of the treatments for these co-occurring conditions. For example, for challenging behavior, we can use behavioral assessment and intervention to improve, but we also have atypical antipsychotics, which in some individuals can make a big difference. And then we're starting to explore other medicines. I just put cannabidiol on here because cannabis related treatments, in this case CBD, which is the part of cannabis that is not psychoactive, so it doesn't lead to any psychoactive properties, but CBD cannabidiol is being studied for improving some of the symptoms that go around autism, like anxiety and challenging behavior. There's a number of different treatments that are available for sleep difficulties, and there are a number of studies about this. It turns out that we can do a much better job than we're doing for people with autism around sleep. And so I tend to preach about, if we improve sleep, we improve not only the sleep of the child, but their daily functioning. And then we also improve the overall quality of life and functioning of the family. And then for treatments, seizures, we have anti-epileptics, and then maybe CBD is also helpful for seizures. There are a number of different treatments for GI difficulties, although I must admit that GI for some individuals can be very, very challenging area. We try to get people referred to a GI specialist who is interested in helping patients with autism whenever we can. ADHD, we have stimulants and non-stimulants, and there was actually just this week a new non-stimulant medication that was approved. And I suspect will be used not only in patients with ADHD, but also patients with autism with ADHD. Anxiety, we have a number of treatments, and hopefully we'll get some more treatments in the future. CBD looks like it may be useful for decreasing anxiety. And then we have a number of different treatments for mood difficulties in individuals with autism. One of the things I like to harp on is so many people with autism have unrecognized mood difficulties. In fact, it may be that as many as 5% of people, maybe even some people say 10% of people with autism have bipolar disorder. And so this has been unrecognized for decades. And it's really, really important that we not attribute mood difficulties just to the person's autism, but also try to understand how we can directly address mood changes. So one of the things we're doing at Autism Speaks, as you notice, not only am I a professor at John Carroll, but I also continue to be the chief science officer at Autism Speaks, and I try to help them with their services and supports as well. And one of the things Autism Speaks is trying to do that I'm really proud of is we've just launched this month. This is Autism Awareness Month. April is always Autism Awareness Month. And just this month, we've launched the Autism Care Network, which is an exciting network around the country. We have 20 sites, and we're planned to grow to up to 50 sites. One of the sites is in Cleveland. It's at Metro Hospital. So I'm really excited to be able to have a site in Cleveland as well. But this network is focused on sustainable care delivery, developing research and evidence base, and disseminating the best possible, the highest possible quality of care for people with autism. So this is a really great network, and I hope that it continues to expand over time, because these kinds of learning health networks have made a huge difference in cancer and epilepsy and many other conditions. And this is the first pediatric mental health network, learning health network in the country. And so to have it be for autism and to have it have a site in Cleveland, I think is a cool thing. The network is really looking at clinical quality improvement, especially we're looking at ways that we can improve early diagnosis in underdiagnosed populations, for example, racial and ethnic minorities and rural populations. And we've set a very particular goal in the network of trying to improve challenging behaviors and increase the percentage of children whose parents report their quality of life as very good or excellent. So this is a goal for next year that we're hoping to work on. And it's a research network as well, so it's trying to really bolster and improve research. So I hope to be able to continue this in my collaborations with Metro over the next few years. One of the things that the network has been working on, and also that Autism Speaks has been funding, is the need to improve the medical transition for adults. You know, a lot of adults, after they leave their pediatrician, they have nowhere else to go. They have no medical home. And so we funded a researcher at Ohio State by the name of Brittany Hand, who has shown that if we have specialized primary care centers for autistic adults, that we can do a much better job in meeting their needs. A fairly obvious question to ask is, what's going on with autism and COVID-19? We've seen a huge impact on people with autism with COVID-19. That impact has been, you know, obviously we're all impacted by COVID-19. It turns out though, and we've studied this now, that families and individuals with autism have been particularly disrupted. It's really due to the changes in their routine, the fact that many individuals with autism get most of their treatment through school districts, and they're no longer receiving the same level or kind of care that they used to receive, the needed care, the needed education that they receive. Many adults with autism are cut off from services or face really strong decreases in services. And many adults with autism actually face the loss of jobs as well. So we've been developing resources at Autism Speaks for individuals to try to, as best as we can, try to help people through the pandemic. This has been a huge challenge for the community. We did a survey, and one of the things we found is not only are we seeing all these disruptions in services, but there's also this major problem with food insecurity. About 70% of families with autism indicated that they were worried that food would run out before they had money to buy more. You know, this is early in the pandemic, but it actually worsened in the fall. And you can see that this is even worse in minority families than it is in many cases in white families. And you can see it's also worse in children with autism than children with no disability. You can see that the food insecurity rates actually increased over time in the fall. And these rates are particularly dramatic in people with autism who are Hispanic or Black non-Hispanic. So one of the other things we did was we tried to look at the prevalence and the impact of COVID-19 infections in terms of hospitalizations, length of stay, and even deaths. And we were able to get access to one of the largest national private insurance claims data sets. It had more than 144,000 people with autism in it. And it captured the data captured the first and second surges, but not the third. So I just want to be clear about that. And we were mostly focused on hospitalization and length of stay because the number of deaths is not a huge number in the data set, thankfully. So what did we find? We found that people with autism had a lower prevalence of COVID-19 infection compared to people with other health conditions, that people with autism had substantially higher risk for hospitalization when they did have a COVID-19 infection. So even though there was a lower prevalence of infection, if they did have an infection, they were much more likely to be hospitalized. And there were a greater percentage of people with autism who died from COVID-19 infection than people with no chronic health conditions. So you can see this in this figure here. People with autism, especially if they had autism and intellectual disability, were 9.3 times more likely to be hospitalized from COVID-19 than people with no chronic conditions. And then I'm going to wrap up by just talking a little bit about some of the advances in interventions and supports that have been generated over the last few years. This first one is very recent. We found that adapted cognitive behavior therapy can help improve anxiety. This adapted cognitive therapy really emphasizes social communication and self-regulation challenges. It helps people with autism to get perspective-taking training. And you can see that it really helps to improve their anxiety post-intervention. So we hope to be able to push this intervention out to more people that would benefit from it. And then we have a program called Echo Autism, which is a model that we developed because we were finding that, yes, you can get high quality healthcare if you live really close to a tertiary care or a specialty care center in a city, but it's very hard to get high quality healthcare if you live in a rural area. And so Echo Autism was really designed to branch out into these rural communities and even overseas as well. So we have some Echo Autism models that have gone overseas into Africa and other continents to try to bring high quality healthcare to individuals with autism. And well, one of the things that we see is that the program really improves clinician knowledge and confidence, but there's still a lot of support to help clinicians change their practice behaviors to help people with autism. And we still see these racial and ethnic disparities in spite of the program. And so there's more work to be done here. And then I wanted to mention this is a very exciting study for those of us that have older adolescents or young adults with autism. Paul Wayman and his group and Lauren Avalone, who I worked with at the Cleveland Clinic, were able to do a program called Project Search Plus Autism Spectrum Disorder Supports. And this program was really designed to help transition age youth get employment and stay employed. And what they found was that the individuals who went through this Project Search Plus ASC supports, 73% of them were able to acquire competitive employment at or above minimum wage 1 year after graduation, compared to 17% of the control group. And a lot of these folks were actually able to maintain this employment over time. So this is pretty exciting. It means if we do the right things for people with autism that are able to seek employment, that we actually can get them, and they're wonderful employees. Many employers will rave about their autism employees because they show up every day. They rarely miss work because they love the consistency of the situation, and they're hard workers. So this is a pretty cool thing. And then now I want to end with this idea that, you know, we have to do a couple of things here in autism. We have to look at these personalized therapeutics that we can create by understanding the biology of autism, but we also have to look for solutions for now. And I hope I've whetted your appetite a little bit around this idea that we kind of want to do both. You know, if we want to make progress, we have to really understand how we can intervene to improve the lives of people with autism through biology, but also by identifying existing solutions and improving them, and then testing them, implementing them, and disseminating them as broadly as possible to the community. So thank you for your time. I know I went really fast. My intention was just to sort of hopefully get people's appetite whetted, and maybe I'll take questions now.
All right. Well, Tom, thank you again so much for being with us this evening. We really appreciate it. I'm going to take down your screen real quick. And then we have a number of questions that have already come in. And if you have other questions that you are still thinking about, feel free to type them in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. The first one is, what resources do you recommend for parents, especially when it pertains to school systems for both K through 8 and in high school?
Sorry, so great question. There's resources on the Autism Speaks website. There's also something we've just created over the last year called Transition Trajectories, or Transition Roadmaps, for individuals who are really all the way starting in junior high up through high school, that is designed to help parents really understand the transition process and what they might be able to get from a junior high or high school setting to help them improve. So that's one place you can go. There also are some local resources. Ocali, the Center for Autism Low Incidence, has resources around schools you can check out. I assume the question is probably more around IEP and other kinds of accommodations or education plans. Our website has a lot of information about getting an individualized education plan in place, how to work with your team. So I'd encourage you to check it out. If you're still not finding stuff, please call the autism response team. It's 888-AUTISM-2. And you can always call and talk to an actual person. Or if you want to go online, you want to talk to a person, you just want to chat with them, you can chat with them. But you can ask that kind of question and they'll point you directly to the resources. They'll send you an email with various resources in it that you can access, and you can go back and forth with them as well.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Another question. In other conditions, a genetic predisposition can be turned on or not turned on by a lifestyle choice. Diet, exercise, sleep, avoid pesticides, etc. Can lifestyle choices help reduce the symptoms of autism too? For example, low sugar choices in food and omega-3 supplements helped their son with ADHD much better than any meds or behavioral therapies.
Well, the short answer is we don't know yet. The longer answer is we suspect yes. Now, when I say we suspect yes, what I mean is that we don't think that lifestyle choices are necessarily going to, take away or totally reduce or in some way radically modify the symptoms of autism. But people with autism probably function better, just like people without autism, if they make better choices about certain things. So, for example, there's some evidence that less sugar and maybe even less food coloring may decrease some of the hyperactivity symptoms that we see in kids in general. So that would be an example where just making some dietary adjustments could make a difference. We also suspect that there may be dietary changes like related to the microbiome that we could make for people with autism that have constipation or other GI difficulties. People have been studying omega-3 supplementation. In fact, Gene Arnold at Ohio State did a study on omega-3 supplements that suggested there might be some benefit there in terms of social communication. There's a researcher out at Phoenix Children's named Richard Fry that's studying a medicine called leucovorin, which is folinic acid, which is pretty closely related to folic acid, if many of the moms here are familiar with that from pregnancy, which may help individuals with autism with improving communication. So there are these kinds of things. I would tell folks, though, it's pretty rare in autism that you won't see some kind of benefit from behavior therapy. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at the treatment studies that have been done in behavior therapy for autism, the effect sizes tend to be very large. And so most people, not everyone, but most people show pretty strong benefit from behavior therapy. My son is an example of a child that showed very limited benefit the first 2 or 3 years he got intensive behavioral intervention. But the main reason for that is we didn't really understand him very well, and we didn't understand his particular needs. And so once we switched him to different types of treatment targets, he actually made really rapid progress with behavior therapy. So I always encourage people, if you're not seeing great progress with behavior therapy, maybe that you need to really think about, get your child tested to understand their particular cognitive strengths and weaknesses, and then talk to your behavioral team and see, are there different ways we can approach the treatment, approach different treatment targets to really see better progress in our child. In my own personal experience, and then of course I ran an intensive behavioral intervention school at the Cleveland Clinic for several years. And, we would see that if we would change up the treatment, change up the targets, change the way the treatment was delivered, we oftentimes could get a much better response in individuals.
Next questions are kind of related. What types of resources are there available for young adults, especially to help socialize and for making friends? And then for what kind of resources are available for high functioning adults in the say 20s, young adults in their 20s as they look to transition to jobs?
Yeah, it's a great question. So these are great questions. So one thing, if they're newly diagnosed, I would encourage them. I would actually encourage them to go to the website and download the 100 Days Kit. There's different 100 Days Kits for different ages, all the way up through adulthood. So download the 100 Days Kit. It was designed to be able to help people get pointed in the right direction right after a diagnosis. So please do that. In terms of people that are maybe a little further along in the journey, I would say, there's a ton of resources in the community about social skills development. We're starting to even see some companies be developed around apps for social skills development. Our autism response team can point you, it's better to have a conversation about individual cases because the spectrum is very broad. And so if you talk about one particular thing, it may not apply to the person or individual, but it's better to have a conversation with somebody, ask them about some of the local resources, whether it be like at Cleveland Clinic or university hospitals or at Metro, or some of we have a really great set of private providers in Cleveland. I mean, we're incredibly blessed in Cleveland for resources for autism. There's a number of providers that offer social groups. KidsLink, for example, in Twinsburg offers game nights for higher functioning individuals that are adolescents or young adults. That was pre-pandemic. I'm not sure what they're doing in the pandemic, but you get the point. The pandemic's been a real disruption. But so there's all kinds of those different kinds of resources. In terms of finding jobs, Autism Speaks just started a Delivering Jobs initiative. And we've been working with a company called Lee Container in Iowa, but also looking to expand that around the country, where we're actually trying to work with individuals, and we're doing these resource fairs around the country. We just did one in Chicago. We've been doing them in more and more places around the country. I'm pretty sure one will be coming to Ohio, if not Cleveland, probably Columbus pretty soon. And these job fairs are really cool because not only is it like information about getting and finding a job, but we actually bring companies into the job fair that want to hire autistic people. So in our first job fair in Chicago, there may have been more, but I'm aware of in the first few hours of the fair, 2 autistic adults were hired in the fair. So it's pretty cool, right? I mean, and we've heard of other successes as well along the way of these. So, that's another option that will be coming up soon. And then Milestones is a great local resource. They have an adult coordinator there who's fantastic. Her name is escaping me right now, and I apologize. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm forgetting her name. I can see her face. But anyway, if you call up Milestones, she's fantastic. So I would talk to her as well. She's very connected in the community with different job opportunities. Good luck. And, I'm always available too. My email was on the last slide. You can contact me and I can try to connect you as well.
Great. Thanks, Tom. And just to confirm, that's autismspeaks.org. Is that the website?
Yeah, autismspeaks.org. You can Google Autism Speaks too. And any way it'll pop up first. So. Okay.
So in relation to the prevalence of epilepsy as a co-occurring condition, do you recommend that all kids with ASD get an MRI of the brain? And if so, by what age?
Well, we don't recommend right now that every child with autism get an MRI. You have to have an indication. And generally speaking, the indications are if you have a very large head circumference, if you have a history of regression, or if you have seizures. I would like to see insurance companies provide better coverage for MRIs than they do for people with autism. But right now, it is not universally recommended for all individuals with autism. It is much easier to get a clinical standard EEG if you suspect seizures. And so I would encourage a person to go see a pediatric neurologist or an adult neurologist, depending upon the age. But for children with autism, there are some really fantastic pediatric neurologists in Cleveland. I worked for many years with Dr. Sumit Parikh at Cleveland Clinic. He is absolutely amazing. So if you can see him, it's great. But there's other great people as well. Nevada Reed at KidsLink is a great pediatric neuro person, and there are many others as well. But get a standard EEG if you suspect seizures. And I would actually argue for trying to get an overnight EEG. My son is actually an example of a child that did not have abnormalities on a standard EEG, but when he got an overnight EEG, they did see abnormalities in his EEG. And that's not that unusual in autism, that you'll catch abnormalities during sleep or during a much longer period of EEG. So in general, I try to advocate for people to get a longer EEG than just your 20-minute standard EEG, but at least start there is my recommendation.
Another question, you mentioned CBD quite a bit when it comes to treatments, right? And I know that's an emerging, treatment, and that you hear in the news a lot. What are the references for those studies? How many studies are out there? What types of products, and what's their efficacy for CBD?
Yeah, well, before I would ever recommend CBD for a person with autism, I mean, I put it on the sides because it's an exciting area because CBD has very, very low side effect profiles. So that's really nice because a lot of people with autism with pharmacology, with medicines, will have side effects. Um, and so, that's the exciting thing. The problem is we haven't seen a lot of great studies yet. So Adi Iran in Israel has done a few randomized controlled trials, and unfortunately he's had a lot of trouble publishing them. I think he's published some of it, but he hasn't published all of it yet. So you can look up his name. His last name is Aran, Adi Iran. I happen to know Adi, and I know he does good work, and he's found some benefits to CBD in people with autism. There's more work that needs to be done there, though. I will also tell you, though, that there's a really strong indication that it may help in certain cases. So I'll tell you that there's a company, again, the name is escaping me. It's late in the day, so I guess I'm having word finding issues. But there's a company that actually has a medicine called Epidiolex. And Epidiolex is just CBD. It's high dose CBD. And they've been able to show this company through some clinical trials that it helps with specific genetic syndromes associated with autism that also have strong seizure profiles. And so it looks like high dose CBD is helpful for seizures, at least in certain cases. And so that's why I talk about it. But the honest thing is we have to do more work there. We have more randomized controlled trials that need to be done before it can be universally recommended.
Thanks, Tom. Our next question actually comes from Tasmania, Australia. And I can honestly say in all of our online programs, we've never had someone from Australia tune in, so thank you. But they are the Deputy Chief Medical Officer in Tasmania, and they have learning health networks for other areas of health, but not for autism. Do you foresee plans to extend the health networks for autism into Australia?
The short answer is I would love to. Please get in contact with me because we do have extensions into Canada already, but we would love to go into Australia. I have one of my close collaborators, Mirko Orjerovic, is at University of Melbourne, and he and I have been talking about different ways to bring some things to Australia. But yes, we have an interest. We would really like to talk more about that. I can introduce this person to Donna Murray, who runs our Learning Health Network. And yeah, it'd be a really great thing to do. Canada, we extended to Canada because they were so interested that their government actually put some money towards it. So maybe we can talk about how to get Australia convinced to do that too. But even if we can't, we can get you started at least in being an affiliate site and working together on implementing some of the things that we're doing.
Wonderful. And then one last question, and I have a couple of quick ones. Someone said they have very good success with ABA therapy for their 6-year-old. Do you have any comments about that type of therapy?
Yeah, well, it's an evidence-based therapy. It's actually an ABA is an umbrella term that people don't really understand. A lot of people think ABA is one thing. It's not one thing. It's actually a set of different technologies that are used to the better term is actually behavior therapy because it's a broader term, and behavior therapy can be implemented in all kinds of different ways. So for example, if I'm droning on and people who have their videos on start looking away from the screen, you're actually punishing me, right? You're telling me that I'm droning on, right? That's punishment. That's a form of behavioral intervention. Now, we don't try to use punishment in behavioral intervention. We try to focus on reinforcement. So if you're shaking your head yes and saying, Dr. Frazier, tell me more, well, you're doing behavior therapy with me. You're engaging in reinforcement for my behavior. So, ABA is a set of techniques and technologies. We know that these techniques work. In fact, they're evidence-based techniques. People have done very rigorous sets of studies on these methods to show that they make a difference. And so the key is finding therapists that know the methodologies, know the techniques, know how to apply them in that particular age range for that type of individual that might need a very specific tailoring of ABA. And, you know, the other thing to keep in mind about ABA is that we continue to learn. And one of the things we've learned is ABA doesn't necessarily need to be so structured as it was in the 80s and 90s. It can be much more flexible, and it can be much more developmentally appropriate for the child's needs. And so a really good practitioner of behavior therapy or ABA is going to be using a lot of developmental psychology to say, okay, what does this child need right now? How do I deliver it in a very naturalistic way? They don't need to sit in a chair. We can play on the floor. We can walk through the neighborhood. You know, we can do whatever. We can do behavior therapy as just a regular function of this child's existence. We don't have to do it in a very special, very artificial circumstance.
Thank you. So the last question I have, and then I want to give you an opportunity to share where people can learn more about your research. I know you're relatively new to John Carroll. Obviously, you're an alum, which we absolutely love and adore the fact that you're at the cutting edge of autism research. But as a professor at John Carroll, how are you helping our current and then future students to learn more about autism research? How are you infusing your research into your teaching of our current and future Blue Streaks?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I've started my lab, and so I have people that are already in my lab that are working with me. A lot of times in the beginning, it's just sort of learning the nuts and bolts of research, right? I mean, you have to teach people how to do good research before, you know, you dive into a lot of specifics. But I recently was able to get a grant from several different foundations that are supporting my research, and that grant is allowing me to collect a lot of data online. So in spite of the pandemic, we're full speed ahead in our research, and that data we'll be able to analyze, and a lot of students are going to be getting involved with me as that data comes in terms of the research process, understanding how to collect, how to analyze data, how to write it up. I have 2 students this semester that have already written papers with me, undergraduate students, and so we're already kind of, even though I've only been at John Carroll for about a year and 3 months, we're already hitting the ground running. We've got a lot of students that are kind of excited about autism. And I should mention Dr. Tracy Masterson in our department is also a really great person. She's helped many, many students get internships and find ways that they can work in autism and get experience in autism. So we've got a really strong department for autism and neurodevelopmental disorders. And I think, you know, one of the things I really would like to see happen is, as we grow our autism offerings, to just make John Carroll a place for individuals that are interested in neurodevelopmental disorders. Maybe they have a family member, a sibling, you know, a friend, someone that they knew from school, and they want to go into this field because it's a really growing area, and there's the opportunity to get a great job and to have a meaningful career. And so, you know, that's what I really like to bring to John Carroll.
Well, thank you again, Tom. I know the university is incredibly fortunate that you have come back home to work and share your research and your knowledge and expertise with our community. And it's been wonderful to have you here sharing a little bit about where we are looking to go in our autism research in our community right now. So thank you again for spending some time with us tonight. Before we say goodbye, I want to give you a quick update on some of our other offerings this upcoming spring through the Office of Alumni Relations. This Thursday, the office will host 2 programs. The first will be at noon and feature Dr. Sheila McGinn, who will speak about how women were the unsung heroes of early Christianity. Her discussion will focus on the apocryphal texts of the Acts of Paul and the Kala, to illustrate an alternate perspective on women's contribution to the shape and spread of the early Christian movement. On Thursday evening, we'll be joined by Christopher Kempf, PhD, class of 2007, who will share his most recent publication, What Though the Field Be Lost, a collection of poems which uses the battlefield at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, as a way to engage ongoing issues involving race, regional identity, and the ethics of memory. The conversation will be moderated by George Bilger, PhD, Professor of English at John Carroll. And on May 5th, we will explore how electricity is at the core of all modern life. Author Craig R. Roach, PhD, class of 1972, will share his work, Simply Electrifying, which offers a comprehensive story of one of mankind's most important journeys, from a time when only a few could ever imagine a world with electricity to today, when for most of us, a world without electricity would be unimaginable. You can find out more information and register for all of our programs, including our Alumni Author Series, Scholarly Luncheons, our A.C.E.S series, and our Alumni Spotlight events at jcu.edu/alumni. Additionally, we invite you to view our recordings of our programs on the JCU Alumni Association website. To view our extensive library, search John Carroll University Alumni on YouTube. This program has been recorded and we'll make sure it gets up on YouTube in the near future as well. Finally, please consider a charitable gift to John Carroll in support of our students, faculty, and our entire campus community. If you've already made a gift this year, thank you for your generosity. If you have not, please join me in supporting John Carroll so that we can continue to deliver an outstanding education for our current and future Blue Streaks. You can make a donation by visiting jcu.edu/give. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Take care, be well, stay safe, and onward on, John Carroll.